insight that the burdens have been shifted from the producer to the consumer was the most insightful thing I heard all day.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Are we live now?
We're good?
Okay. I will stop.
Okay.
It's yours.
Thank you, sir. Welcome, everybody. This is our final panel of the day. It's really been a pretty amazing day, some tremendous content, and this is a great way to end it. This is, are the typhoon narratives failing? And this is our media panel for the day. I'm the moderator. My name is Paul Roberts, and I'm the editor-in-chief of a publication called The Security Ledger, a small independent cyber security publication I set up back in 2012. And equally as relevant, founder of a nonprofit organization called Secure Resilient Future Foundation that is working to promote smart cyber policies. And really thrilled to be with this amazing panel today of very, very accomplished cybersecurity journalists. And we're going to be here talking about Volt Typhoon, about sophisticated threat actors and their deep and sustained interest in critical infrastructure here in the United States and other countries as well. And as media representatives, as reporters, whether we're doing the job that needs to be done, covering that issue in its complexity and informing the public in the way that they need to be informed. What I'd like to do is just start out by letting my panel introduce themselves. And I'll go to Sean Lyngaas, right to the left of me. Sean, say hi.
Hi, I'm Sean Lyngaas. I cover cybersecurity for CNN. Been covering cybersecurity since about 2013 and have done some freelancing on other topics, but really happy to be here.
Next to Sean is Kim Zetter. Kim?
Hi, I've been covering cybersecurity, national security for more than 15 years. Started at Wired for about a decade, and then moved freelance doing New York Times Magazine, Washington Post, Politico. And I wrote a book on OT about Stuxnet, Countdown to Zero Day.
One of the great cybersecurity books out there. If you haven't read it,
For sure.
get it. Eric.
I'm Eric Geller. I'm a senior reporter at Cybersecurity Dive. I've been covering cybersecurity since 2015, including 6.5 years at Politico, including with Maggie. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And Maggie.
And hi, I'm Maggie Miller. Really, really honored to be here on this panel with some greats to my right. As Eric just said, I'm a cybersecurity reporter at Politico. I've been covering cybersecurity for about 9 years now, priors at Inside Washington Publishers and The Hill. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Welcome to everybody. I mean, as you've heard in numerous talks today, you know, the stakes here are very high. It seems likely that sophisticated threat actors, whether they're cyber criminal or nation state or both, have access to our critical infrastructure, may have the ability to kind of shut off our lights or cut out our water infrastructure and what would follow from that. I wanted to start with the Volt Typhoon threat actor group. I mean, the typhoons generally, the typhoons are all China associated. Volt Typhoon gets a lot of coverage and notoriety for being sophisticated in their techniques, living off the land techniques, using common administrative tools to sustain their position within compromised environments. They've been around for a few years. I wanted to get a thought, just some input from each of you. Kind of what exposure have you had to the Volt Typhoon as a topic, and how have you seen the narrative around Volt Typhoon change in the last, let's say 4 years since it first kind of popped onto the thing? Maggie, I'd start with you.
All right, I'm happy to start. I feel like I should defer, but yeah, Volt Typhoon has been one of the key topics, I think, on this beat for the past, what would it be? I think it was May 2023 that Microsoft first put out the report and immediately changed the game, I would say, on coverage of what nation states were able to do in the US. And I know under the previous administration, that was a major, major focus of CISA. And, you know, you couldn't go to any event, not just CISA, other agencies as well, without some of the leaders really talking about and detailing the access that Beijing was able to get into critical infrastructure across many sectors. So that was a major topic of my reporting, I would say, for the year and a half after that. Things shifted a little bit in terms of government side reporting on this, I would say, when the second Trump administration came into power. There's been a lot less, I would say, public statements by officials in the current administration on this issue. Although we did see Director Anderson this morning talking about there being cyber actors pre-positioned in our network still. But it certainly has transitioned, I would say, and it wouldn't be, you know, under the Biden administration, it was a huge, huge focus of a lot of the government efforts, and now that's kind of shifted. So that's been my exposure.
Kim?
Anyone else?
So I actually haven't covered the typhoons very much, but my observation, because there was a lot of initial reporting about it and it trickled out, and the initial complaints, of course, were that there was sort of public announcements about it without actually backing it up with a lot of detail. People that I spoke with complained about that a lot. Practitioners saying that they didn't have IOCs, they didn't know where to look for in the networks. There's been some really great reporting on that, those complaints, and then it went kind of quiet in the last couple of years.
We're going to talk about the quiet.
So,
Sean?
Yeah, I'll just say that, you know, the 60 Minutes did a piece on Volt Typhoon last year or something like that.
Yep.
I was excited about that because it was, you know, one thing that I think a lot about is I mean, I work for a television network now, and so the task of telling that story on camera is pretty difficult, especially when you have this real threat, but it's also it's here, but it isn't. You know, it's like we were preparing for this. It's pre-positioning, so it's not an active. Well, I shouldn't say it's not an active thing, but it's something that we have to like conceptualize, and it isn't as easy for people to do that. So I was pleased when 60 Minutes did it.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that before Volt Typhoon, we as reporters and maybe researchers as well always thought of, you know, Russia as the OT threat. I mean, not that China wasn't or anything, but Volt Typhoon really, you know, China always had the volume and certainly the capabilities. But when this happened, I was kind of, I was alarmed. I mean, it was another level of thing to think about. I just go back to it. It's a difficult thing to report on because you're talking about if that, this, then that. I mean, if we're talking about an invasion of Taiwan, then these are the things that might be activated. Like Maggie said, Microsoft was the first one to put out a report on, which is often the case. And so they get first sort of narrative. And then, okay, you want to find out what's really going to happen. You got to go to, actually should probably fly to Guam and talk to the water tank operator there, because that's where they got hit. So it's been, and then
that was one of the first incidents that really got coverage, was them seemingly looking to disable military infrastructure in Guam.
Right.
Yeah.
And just real quickly, I mean, the last administration, I mean, it wasn't actually administration specific necessarily, but we would go to the NSA for media briefings on this topic, and we would have that. And so that would make it easier to report on. Now, not so much. And, you know, there's sort of a void of information out there about it.
Correct.
Yeah, I would say two things. First, Sean's right that it's hard to cover something that's primarily meant as a deterrent that's not being triggered in the moment. It's hard enough when you're trying to get information about an attack that has happened where you know the victim, but when it's a ton of cyber time bombs and you don't know where they're going to be triggered, but you can sort of guess what kind of infrastructure, but you don't know the specific actors. It's very difficult to illustrate that in a way that the average reader can understand, because you have to talk high level about they're going to do it to our water system, they're going to do it to our hospitals, but any individual reader might not think, oh, that's going to happen to my hospital, that's going to happen to my water system. Whereas when there is a hack in your community, the coverage brings that home to you. It's very difficult to do when you don't know who the victims are. The other thing I'll say is, I think the biggest impact of Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon as well, to a different degree, is that it really kickstarted the transformation of national cybersecurity from prevention to resilience. And I think really got more people talking about how we can't just focus on making sure they don't get in, because they're going to get in. I mean, obviously, it didn't take Volt Typhoon to show that they can get in. We had SolarWinds, we had, every manner of attack you can think of. But this was the first time that policymakers started to say, from a national security perspective, we need to start talking about this as if we're going to get hit and as if it's going to be bad. And for whatever reason, whether it's not wanting to create fear or any other reason that there might be, that wasn't what they were doing before. They didn't talk in terms of, we're going to get hit and there's going to be a crisis and we need to weather it. They didn't want to scare people. Now, and they're doing it in a measured way, the conversation is, there are going to be major hacks of our hospitals and our banking systems and our water systems. What we need to do is make sure we can still get money and get drinking water. And I think that's the only responsible approach, because you don't want to tell people we're going to make sure they don't get in. Because then when they do get in, which we know they will, and they have, it's even worse than if you told them in advance that they were going to get in, if you primed people to get ready for that possibility. Right. So I think that's been a huge conceptual change.
Go ahead, Kim.
Can I add something? So I've been covering this long enough to remember that this isn't the first time there is reporting on China being inside critical infrastructure. Back in 2009, a reporter with the Baltimore Sun, Siobhan Gorman, had written stories saying that China was in our electric grid. And it was the same quotes from government saying they're pre-positioning, they are sitting in there, and they are going to cause some kind of disruption in the event of some kind of war or other activity with the United States. The difference, of course, then was that that possibility didn't seem so imminent, right? And I asked General Nakasone about this. I said, why is this different from the reports that were coming out of government back in 2009 that China was in the grid? And he's just said, I mean, other than the fact that it's more imminent as a danger, but he also said it's just more sophisticated and it's harder to find them. So, so I think that the government was right to ratchet up the message, but I think that the fact that it wasn't, again, I'll just repeat, it wasn't backed by a lot of detail in which people could grab some evidence and say, okay, how do we find them in the network? I think was difficult. Even the stories out of Guam, sort of the patient zeros, they were saying, yeah, FBI came to us and they wanted to route through our network, but they didn't tell us what they were looking for. They didn't tell us how we could find what they were looking for. And we don't have any evidence that they're actually in our network. We only have FBI telling us. So I think the messaging on this and the coordination could have been better.
So one of the themes that came up in a lot of your comments was the change in the conversations that's going on around critical infrastructure risks and threats like Volt Typhoon, that in the previous administration, there was a lot more open discussion of state threat actors, and in particular China. I think if you look objectively at just CISA alerts regarding China state actors, 2022 through 2024, quite a few. Since 2024, it's not that many. So I'm interested in just let's dig a little deeper on that lack of communication around these threat actors. How are you experiencing that, and also how is it impacting your ability as a journalist, as a reporter, to cover these issues and these incidents? Do we feel like, well, there's not a lot of talk because the threats and the attacks are diminished and it's a quieter threat landscape, or not? Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I can start on that. One, and I think that was borne out today at this conference, I don't think the threat has changed or gone anywhere, particularly given that the geopolitical tensions between the US and China are still pretty high. I think that's fair to say. I think it has been very fascinating to see the change from just generally on China policy from the first Trump administration to this current one. I came into the cybersecurity field in 2017, and I work at least a day each week at the Capitol. And I would say lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, but particularly the Republican Party. I mean, there was a bill introduced every week, trying to counter the use of Chinese technology, really trying to sound the alarm on China. But there has been a major switch, I would say, in this administration in terms of my coverage. And I think some of that is definitely a strategy. I know that there were reports that some sanctions involved in some of these attacks were delayed by the president because of his efforts to negotiate with China. And, I think that, for example, the national cyber strategy that came out this year doesn't include any mentions of either Russia or China. Again, I think that is on purpose in terms of different efforts the administration's trying to undertake. But it has meant that generally, Sean mentioned we all used to go to the NSA for briefings under the previous administration. Probably once a year we'd go up and, we'd all be put through intense security, and we got to speak with General Nakasone or someone else high up about what they were seeing. And under also the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, there were a lot of chats with CISA about these types of nation state issues. And that is definitely, faded, I would say, gone downhill. And I think some of that, CISA has gone through a lot in the last year, so they might be prioritizing other issues. But I don't know if some of my colleagues want to add.
I would just say two things. First, I think the dramatic downsizing of CISA has played a significant role. It's not just that they have fewer people, it's also that the Trump administration's approach to the agency has really alienated a lot of the outside stakeholders. And that doesn't always just mean like the CISA people aren't showing up at meetings. Sometimes it means the outside entities don't want to share everything with CISA that they used to. I've definitely talked to infrastructure operators that are not as comfortable reporting things as they used to be. It's going to be very interesting after CERCIA takes effect, which will mean that they have to report those things to see how they get around the new sensitivities that they have. So part of it is there's new tension with what is left of CISA. It pains me to say it that way, but I think that is accounting for some of the lack of public conversation.
Is the concern that the information would be misused or abused, or that it would not be
I think
secure?
There's just a general question mark about will the protections be respected the way they used to be?
Right.
Are the people in place who can actually manage that? And I'm not saying that I personally believe that they won't be. I'm saying that is a concern that other people have. And that's affecting the quality of the information sharing from what I understand. The second piece is the Volt Typhoon China infrastructure issue has been bound up in the trade negotiations, which, unlike in the past where the government was not necessarily afraid of talking about China's hacking threat, even though they did want to do trade stuff, now there's this perception that if we acknowledge that they are an aggressive cyber actor, it is going to, in the, I think, fairly transactional view of the president, it's going to sort of frustrate Xi Jinping. It's going to alienate them. It's going to make them less likely to want to do a trade deal. So we have to talk about them like they're great friends, like they're not doing anything uniquely malign. The president has even said, everybody hacks. First said that about Russia, and I think more recently said that about China. So there's this idea that it's not as bad as the experts say, because if it was, we couldn't possibly keep that quiet while we do a trade deal with China. So the idea is we're just going to downplay the severity of it and try to work with them on other aspects of the relationship.
Yeah, I mean, to your question about access to government officials or agencies, I mean, certainly it's something I think a lot about, but sometimes I just tell myself to get on with it, and you got to be more creative as a reporter. Boohoo if you're not being granted interviews, or if people are trying to squelch information. That's just another day in reporting. So go to other sources for information. I mean, surely there's enough stories from the private sector, from the nonprofit sector. If people want to be, I mean, adversarial is not necessarily a bad thing, but if really adversarial in terms of we're not going to talk to you from government agency X, then, I mean, you can make the point to them that it's not about you. It's about the story. It's about the information that I'm seeking. Let's try to, all be grown-ups about it and engage, spar. And then when the interview's over, everyone goes home. But that's just not really the case right now. So you got to look to your longtime sources, trusted sources. Then you got to look to new folk, new conversations that people you meet at this conference, kind of thing. So I think it's, yeah, I think there's just so much out there to report on that it does, you're wasting your time if you're complaining too much about access.
So because there's so much knowledge and expertise in this room, but not a lot about being a reporter. You all have that expertise. How does it, not having access to those, senior CISA officials or FBI or what have you, how does that sort of change the perspective or the approach to writing about threats like, state-sponsored hacks? And is it just you're much more reliant on industry and to provide you with that information, or Sean?
I think we're always relying on industry to a certain because of telemetry and their visibility, and Microsoft probably sees more
Talking to
than most. So I don't think that's changed, and I wouldn't say that government resources have been cut off or anything. It's still possible. It's just harder. But if others have thoughts, please.
Yeah, I would say the front door is never the most productive door to get information from government. The best sources are the people on the ground, boots on the ground, doing the actual work. The people who aren't doing the official statements. So the fact that they are cutting off access doesn't really change what reporters can do. If you look at, as an example, right, with the Department of Defense, when they basically told that they weren't going to be talking to reporters from mainstream media, and then all these leaks come out. So that's never been the way that reporters get information or solid information. So it doesn't really impact. What does impact, however, is the hunting that the government has been going on. There's always been this sort of respect for the freedom of the press. And there's been procedures in place with the Justice Department about when government would seek reporters' records and things like that. And that's eroded under this administration. If we look at what happened with the Washington Post reporter, where they seized her phone and her laptop. And so I think that reporters have to be more strict with how they protect sources and how they view Justice Department. I think that we've sort of relied on that kind of gentleman's agreement in the past and cannot rely on it anymore. So.
Gentleman's agreement, really?
I'm just going to hold this. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, going through the front door, you always ask for comment, of course. I mean, wrote something yesterday about a DHS action. You go to DHS for comment. They're not going to give you anything. That's not just this administration. That's, they're just going to give you a bland statement. So I think, making inroads as best as you can and trying to maintain good sources. And I will say I have made sure that upper editors of Politico, especially in the last year and a half, know what an ISAC is. They have been fantastic across every single sector, always has been, but I would say it's, those types of information sharing groups and the folks that are involved in driving them. Shout out to all of you. But yeah, I would say in the last year, reporting, we were saying this, we were chatting about this, this panel before we got here a couple days ago. And I think we all agreed, I've never, in the 9 years I've been reporting on this beat, I have done as much on background calls in the 8 years prior to the last year. Like they're equal. Folks they are still very willing to chat, but not on the record. So that I think is a major change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say the interesting thing about cyber journalism and probably many forms of journalism, especially over the past few years, is when the relationships between, let's say, CISA and the ISACs or the trade groups were really relatively smooth and people had disagreements, but they at least all understood that there was a commitment to resourcing and there was a commitment to moving forward together. It was sometimes harder to get candid perspectives from those outside partners because they didn't want to mess up a good thing. They didn't want to interfere in partnerships that were working well. And as those relationships have kind of atrophied, more people are actually willing to talk because there isn't some great partnership that they're worried about spoiling. And they also obviously want to use us as an outlet for their complaints about how the government is approaching these issues. So, and again, this is not unique to cyber, but like journalists in general have to be careful that we're not just allowing industry or government, I would say, although less commonly government, to use us as basically just a place to criticize whoever they are butting heads with in their relationship. So usually that's industry using us to complain about government. Sometimes it can be the other way around, but that has definitely been something I've noticed over the past few years. People are more willing to complain because for them, from their perspective, there's more to complain about than there has been in the past. And so you do have those questions of how much credence do I give this person's complaint? But to that point, I would say there's a lot of publicly available evidence that a lot of those complaints have merit. More people are voicing them. There's more reason to think that they're true. So it cuts into, I think, the normal skepticism that a lot of reporters have about this doesn't necessarily seem like it's on the level. I'm sure things are, not that bad. Well, we have more evidence than we used to that things are not going as well as they used to be.
Mm. I mean, one of the challenges about covering a group like Volt Typhoon or nation state attacks on critical infrastructure is the kind of low noise aspect of these compromises. Writing about things like the Mirai botnet or NotPetya or, him and I, SQL Slammer. Those are noisy, disruptive cyber attacks. Easy to latch onto and figure out what to write about. A long-term quiet presence on critical infrastructure. How do we as the media find a way to relate that to keep the public informed about that risk, even though seemingly they're okay, they're on critical infrastructure, not doing anything. So is there a story here? I guess, how do you manage it?
I think I say this a lot, but it's something I believe, like just latching onto characters. If the threat is more intangible, then maybe you can tell the story through the eyes of some of the people on the front lines. Mm-hmm. Of course, that's what the goal is, but people are interesting, and there's all kinds of characters in this industry who are doing amazing things. When you talk to them, they unload on they like talk a mile a minute, and their brain to go every which way. Where they tell you so many things, and it's your job to distill that in a narrative that people want to read and make you want to make especially where I am now, vis-a-vis past places I've been. I really got to communicate at a high level to mom and dads and grandpas and everything who people can understand. So some of my favorite stories, I mean, not specific to Volt Typhoon, but some of my favorite stories on the cyber beat have been where you have these central characters that you can, I interviewed the guy behind the Conti leaks, this Ukrainian guy who was interesting, you know, had to keep him anonymous, but he was in Ukraine doing the leaks, dumping on this ransomware gang, trying not to get blown up, trying to get his family out. And I was on the phone with him a lot, and that was like, I couldn't use his name, but I could use his story, and it was like, wow, you know, this guy, he can't shoot a gun to save his life, he said. So, but it's, you know, I can fight with my keyboard, and so people like that keep you coming back and keep non-cyber people hooked a little bit. And then, you know, other examples have been like when, you know, hospitals get ransomware and you talk to the people who are dealing with that and what went through their mind and that kind of thing. So Volt, you know, how do you do that with Volt? I mean, it's a little bit hard, but you can find, I mean, the Littleton, Massachusetts thing was great. I'm sure I didn't realize Lauren's slide, 200 utilities. I didn't realize that was the number. So maybe, okay. Maybe second source on that. Yeah. But, you know, there's still, the further you get away from DC in smaller areas, sometimes people are more willing to pipe up sometimes, you know?
I'll just say very simply that anytime I write about China or Chinese cyber activity, which is often, I will always try to include at least a sentence or two on Volt Typhoon as background and link to prior coverage, whether it's mine or coverage by these wonderful reporters.
I would say that in addition to what Sean is talking about is making sure that you put people into the story. I think technical details are important. I think that they give the people, and it doesn't have to be really, really down in the weeds technical, but details are important to a story, because simply saying that a bank got hacked is not the same as saying they got into the transactional system, they had the ability to move money around, not be detected. They had all of the correspondence of customers and things like that. Those details are significant and they're important, because one of the things that we fight as reporters are the fatigue of readers and also of writers. Like, you get the same breach story over and over again. And something has to be unique or to rise to a certain level just to merit coverage, right? And people will often ask us, well, what does it take to get coverage of something? And it often does have to be something unique, something that adds to the story, something that takes it up to the next level, but anything with details. And those details land not only for the reporter and their editor, because that's going to help get buy-in from an editor on a story, but it's also going to land for readers. It's not just this abstract breach anymore. They can actually picture what's going on, and they can also, and it's not just you saying that it was sophisticated or not sophisticated. You're actually providing the details. You're showing them, right? How it was sophisticated or how it was completely unsophisticated.
Go ahead, Eric.
Well, you mentioned not pitches, so I have to bring up my favorite example of making the impact concrete, and why this is so hard with Volt Typhoon, because so much of that is latent activity. But my favorite example is from Andy Greenberg's Sandworm book, where he talks about how the malware basically crippled the computers that tell container ships where to offload their cargo. And it also, interestingly, turned off the computers at the entrance to the port where the trucks pull in. So you had these lines of trucks stopped outside ports, and there was actually a Homeland Security concern that these trucks were just sitting here and they were a potential a victim of a terrorist attack. You know, they were a potential target for terrorists or criminals, because you have these trucks that can't go anywhere because the Windows computer at the front door of the port is offline because of a piece of computer code that escaped Ukraine. I mean, that's a breakdown in the global logistics system because of a cyber attack. And that's not even a cyber story anymore. I mean, that you don't have to care about cybersecurity at all. There's trucks that can't get into a port that might be hijacked and can't bring you your cars, your computers, your clothes, whatever you need because of a computer failure. You don't have to care at all about cybersecurity to be really scared of that. And that's also a great example of a real impact that isn't fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You know, so much of cybersecurity can feel like doomsaying because we're saying they could turn off the water, they could poison you, they could kill you. Well, this wasn't that, but it was really serious. And importantly, it was very obvious. It was in front of you. If you lived in these communities, if you had ever gone to a port, you can physically go to these places and there's pictures from the time of what that actually looked like. It's not inside a computer, it's on the road outside the port. And to me, that it's so evocative that you, again, don't have to care about cybersecurity to find that story interesting and compelling.
I'll just add to that as another example. One, totally agree with Eric. You know, if you can say, hey, I have evidence, maybe it's unnamed, but there's this petrochemical facility in this state, and here's exactly what happened with the operators, things like that. That's much easier to pitch to an editor. And another, you know, I like to say, you know, looking back to May 2021, there is before Colonial Pipeline and after in terms of covering cybersecurity. I was writing for The Hill at the time, and, you know, they maintained a cybersecurity reporter. You know, they paid me. They were happy that I was writing for them. Every editor and their mother woke up to my existence that week, and everybody wanted stories. I mean, I probably wrote 6 a day, it felt like. And people in my life who had nothing to do with cybersecurity and kind of vaguely understood what I wrote about were calling me, texting me, wanting to know more. And, you know, those stories, you know, lit a fire in the Biden administration. I mean, I remember, you know, we had the Secretary of Transportation briefing on how he was moving you know, oil supplies down the coast. There were stories about people filling up trash bags of gasoline. You know, it really hit people.
Even video.
Yeah,
right?
I will stop my TED talk. But all that to say, the more detail you can have that really fires people's imagination, frankly, makes a better story.
I just want to add very briefly that we've seen this over the past 10 years in particular with election security, which used to not be, you know, the election security, the idea of protecting voting machines and all that. It's been a thing for a long time, mostly in the physical domain. But my first day at Politico was June 14th, 2016, which was the day that the Russian hack of the DNC was announced. And that instantly became the #1 thing that we focused on as a team, because it connects cybersecurity, which again often feels very ephemeral, to the absolute core of American democracy. And that's kind of what you were saying about giving the average person and the average editor a hook to understand why what we're doing over here in the little cyber corner actually matters. Once you start talking about, can we safely elect a president? You know, I think much like you, I was known to a lot more people than I was before that, because suddenly cybersecurity matters for a lot more than people used to think it did.
Okay, one more question, and we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So get your mind turning. Just kind of flipping it around, we spend a lot of time thinking and writing and talking about, you know, the sophisticated techniques that actors like Volt Typhoon use, you know, live off the land techniques, PowerShell scripts, and privilege escalation, and so on. Are we kind of missing the forest for the trees? And should we be focusing more on, as I think many of the talks have suggested, just the real dearth of secure practices and infrastructure that fuel the attacks? Kim, you wrote a piece on the attack on the Polish critical infrastructure, wind farms and so on, that where you had this infrastructure deployed with, you know, default usernames and passwords that were obviously easy prey. Should there be more focus on a media standpoint from that as a sort, you know, just the lack of secure practices rather than, you know, what Chinese state actors are doing technically?
So yes, short answer is yes, but we end up writing that same story over and over again, unfortunately. So in 2015, when Russia took out part of the grid in Ukraine, I wrote a story about the fact that they were so successful because Ukraine, those distribution plants were not using multi-factor authentication.
Mm-hmm.
And I got some text messages from someone, a practitioner here in the US, who said that he was using that story to pass around to all of his clients that he has been yelling at for years to deploy multi-factor authentication. And here was an actual case example of a real world situation involving physical effects, which we hadn't seen since Stuxnet. And it was all because they hadn't bothered to use MFA. And then here we are, Colonial Pipeline, right? So one of the things that really frustrated me about Colonial Pipeline, and I've sort of beaten up on them. I did a keynote at Black Hat, and I did testified at a hearing on Capitol Hill where I felt a little bad doing it, but I'm so frustrated at the reception that Capitol Hill gave to Colonial Pipeline after that incident. If you go back and you look at the recording, there were probably half a dozen or more lawmakers that thanked Colonial Pipeline for showing up, said to them over and over again, "You're the victim here. We understand that." And you can imagine that there was probably some kind of backroom agreement that for Colonial Pipeline to even agree to come testify, there was an assurance that they were going to get that they weren't going to get accused of anything. And so what does the CEO get up there and do? He talks about how really strongly segmented their networks were. Well, if the networks were so segmented, why did they have to shut down? Because they claimed that the malware might travel from the IT to the OT network. And we all know what was going on with Colonial Pipeline in terms of security. Legacy systems, legacy credentials hadn't been disabled, all of that. So we keep hearing that over and over again. In the case of Poland that you bring up, that wasn't a US system, but everyone is on notice about MFA, about default credentials, all of this. And I don't think that we can put that in stories, but if lawmakers and regulators and governments aren't holding the owners of critical infrastructure to task for this stuff, it doesn't really matter to report it, unfortunately.
I would just add to that. I think the sort of Colonial example, it points to this really important dichotomy in how we talk about the victims of cyber attacks. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who really emphasize that we need to treat Microsoft, Colonial Pipeline differently from your average water utility or hospital when we talk about why they were hacked and whether it could have been prevented. I mean, even if the techniques that are used and the vulnerabilities that exist are the same, acting like Colonial Pipeline could not have foreseen the problems that it experienced is very different from acting like a small water utility that didn't have, let's say, help from the DEF CON Franklin folks, didn't have local grant funding. Somebody like that, they're in a much worse position to be able to do what they need to do, even though it may be the same things that we're asking them to do. The resources and the knowledge are very different. There's a huge disparity there. I don't think that always translates to press coverage or to congressional response. I think there's a sensitivity to treating anybody as culpable when they are attacked. You so often hear that we wouldn't blame a bank for being robbed. We wouldn't, blame somebody for being burglarized. But actually, I would blame my bank, which is a very large and well-resourced bank, if it left the door open and the admin password was 1111, like for the PLCs that Iran popped. Right. That's I think pretty reasonable blame, but that doesn't necessarily translate to cyberspace because there's this idea that it's esoteric and we can't, the sophisticated techniques, who could possibly have stopped the Russian government? That obfuscation benefits people who do not deserve the benefit of the doubt.
Okay. Excellent. Let me, thank you. Let me open it up to questions from the audience. I'm sure we got a few. Yeah.
Who was first? I'll go to Duncan first.
Hi, Duncan Sparrow, old cyber curmudgeon. Are the Typhoon narratives failing? China, I believe, has a whole of society effect, and the Typhoon is just one of the set of typhoons. Is just part of their overall structure. No one's mentioned the word disinformation yet. How much of the narratives failing do you think is because all of a sudden you're competing with disinformation, state-sponsored disinformation?
Sean.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I write a lot about Chinese disinformation too. It just comes from different sources than, you make a good point. It shouldn't necessarily be treated entirely separately. With every story like this, we have to go to the Chinese embassy for comment, which is always a robust comment.
Yes.
Often the same comment. But yeah, there's a whole ecosystem of I guess sock puppets out there that are making it. I guess it depends. It matters when it's having an impact and they're actually gaining traction online. A lot of the stuff that I see from Chinese disinformation, other state-sponsored disinformation is often just kind of like it's a tree in the falling in the forest, like it's not getting a lot of uptick. That said, it's something I think about a lot, and not just Chinese sources. When I write, you think about how it might be or how it might be exploited, what you're putting out, who's reading it. Okay, you write factual information about voting machines. Yes, there are vulnerabilities, but here's how to fix them. You check out who's actually reading and sharing the article. It's a little bit depressing. But yeah, that's a good question. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to just briefly on that, because he brought up the election stuff. This doesn't have to do with Chinese disinformation, but this is something that I think Eric has experienced as well. I've been writing about election security since 2004, and delving deeply into the vulnerabilities, technical vulnerabilities in the voting machines. And the people who were doing a lot of that legwork were election activists, integrity activists, who were really had the interests of democracy in mind. And then what happens in 2020, stories that I wrote about vulnerabilities then are used, let's say weaponized, by groups that are using that same information. It's all factual. The vulnerabilities are there. The problems exist in the voting machines, but now it's weaponized for political purposes. And instead of it being used to try and drum up interest in fixing the problems, it's being used to basically question the integrity of elections and erode our faith in those. And it's become a real problem because you can no longer write about vulnerabilities in voting machines anymore.
I had some
Because of
security
it.
ledger story where I had, from like 2013 or something on, Chinese components and voting machines. And, all of a sudden, in 2020, that story, like, I was like, what? It's all this traffic. Like, what? And it was like, somebody had obviously found it. And it was just fueling that. Oh, it's the Chinese. Yes.
We got a lot of questions. I'm going to take a co-host privilege for a hot second. I'm finding a very deep reaction. I've known some of you for 25 years, at least two of you. We've seen, as an example, Nicole Perloff has the To Catch a Thief story. Many of us in this room were seeing the Chinese espionage, had data on the Chinese espionage. We're trying to get coverage of the Chinese espionage. We couldn't get any attention at all. And I'm feeling a lot of that muscle memory right now, which is some of these stories are much easier to tell after the fact than while they're currently happening. And some of it was if it bleeds, it leads, or no one was talking about it, or you weren't elite enough. There's a ton of people in this room with really actionable information on current Volt recruitment and access campaigns, current use of residential proxies, stories about how many of them were enabled by known exploited vulnerabilities in security products. When I did the testimony 4 weeks ago, people were gobsmacked. There's only 420 members of the ISAC. They didn't know until a hearing. I think these are stories that are tellable, and this isn't a condemnation of anyone on the dais. It's saying these are hard stories to tell. Perhaps the activity from China is preying on our gray space and our blind spots. Is there an affirmative, optimistic challenge we can give to ourselves to try to lean into some of the stories we know can be told eventually, but can we tell them now? Is the challenge question optimism? So we're not doing this 10 years later of how come nobody saw this, interviewing everybody that ignored it. So I would like to avoid that blood pressure 10 years from now on what's happening in real time now.
Need less corporate NDAs for that to happen.
Yeah, I would say at least 2 people coming to us. So that's one of the biggest issues we sometimes have is one person will come to us with a tip, but then it's really hard to get the second source. So if you come to us with a tip, maybe you come to us with a friend. I'm just saying.
Also, sorry, with regard to your statement about not being able to get coverage during certain periods of time, you also have to look at everything else that's going on during a period. And after 2016, it was Russia. Everything was Russia. What's interesting is that prior to 2016, even in government wasn't paying attention to Russia. The focus in government was on counterterrorism. All the way in from 2001 until 2016, that's where all the money was going. That's where all the attention was going. So, and then we've got the interference in the election in 2016, and wham, all the attention goes to Russia. So it's really hard sometimes, and the stories merit it, I'm with you. But it's really hard to write about something that editors don't want to, they'll ask why. What's the point now? Why is this important to tell this story now? And also readers. So, writing about anything related to cybersecurity right now, is hard because all of the focus is on, well, for the last year, it was on Doge, and it was on, CISA cutting, those kinds of really important things in terms of administration and government. So I think that it would be helpful for readers and for sources to know that timing is important in a story. And even if people come to me with something and it's an important story, but it's just not the right time for it, it's hard to convince them of that. It's hard to explain that. So maybe just something to consider in terms of timing. Absolutely those stories. And as more time passes, it's better to tell those stories often because there are more people who are willing to disclose more information. I'm always open to, I love actually looking back at things that didn't get enough coverage. So yeah.
Maybe one more question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks.
Mark.
Know and appreciate all of you. This has been really weird because the information flow has totally changed. When major incidents happen, normally, as a security researcher, I work with other security researchers to tackle the problems, come up with solutions. But because of the secrecy that's been slapped on this, it's all underground. There are no collaboration groups in the major groups now on these things. They're all deeply underground. A lot of my information is coming from you guys. Like collaborating with you has helped find me the people to talk to drive it. And I'm just wondering how much of that information flow has changed for you guys as well. And what can we all do together to try and change this again? Because this is not a good direction.
Really good points. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, I would say that collaboration, and I get a little nervous talking as a reporter about collaboration because there's a wall. Even though sources are your helpers, you have to maintain a certain distance in order to be able to evaluate the source and the information that they're giving you. But there is a very valuable relationship that goes on between sources and reporters. And what I find is that when I've worked with people who are with security companies, they can only take a story so far. They can only tell you what's in the code. They can only tell you what they see, but they can't tell you why it happened or the context or things like that. And that's something as a reporter that I can do, is that I can then go to the people that got impacted or go to even the people who committed the offense, possibly, because hackers do talk to reporters, and get that wider story. So there is a really important and significant collaboration that goes on between reporters and people in the technical world. And that collaboration can help tell a larger and deeper story.
Yeah, real quickly. Thanks for the question, Mark. I don't need to tell you about the way that good faith research has been demonized and somehow flipped on its head to be some sort of bad thing. I covered the CTI League when it first started. When the ecosystem's working well, like Kim said, the reporter has to be careful. Can't just say, how can I help you? What can I do for you? But, we're sharing information when you're comfortable with it. But you all are privy to certain things that we aren't, and maybe vice versa. But if the reporting's good and then you see something, read an article and say, I know more about that than you know, listen to me, maybe there's a good follow-up story. But I guess it involves not letting the haters win, for lack of a better description. Just like, okay, there's going to be some utter distortions of, we're in the upside down of like, oh, you formed a league to help hospitals when they're getting hacked. That sounds nefarious to me. of course not. But somehow that was cast that way, right? But so you just have to keep going and keep putting out information that literate people will understand as a good thing, and just hope it keeps going.
Well, I'd like to say thank you to our panelists, and the work that you do is so important, especially in this age of disinformation campaigns and AI generated slop. The fact that you're out there talking to real humans, getting actual factual information and relaying it to the public is incredibly important for us to all understand what's going on out there from a cybersecurity perspective. And just thank you for the work that you do every day. And thanks for joining us on this panel.